Hi, and welcome to Sunday's edition of the Gender Speaker Live show, where I've got into the habit of talking about history. And today I'm looking at drag and cross dressing, something that's been with me all my life. So let's get on and have a look at it. So, drag and cross-dressing, that's, I think we tend to think of drag and cross-dressing as something that's relatively modern, something that came out of the 20th century. But the reality is, drag and cross-dressing goes back a long way. The very first recorded incident of somebody cross-dressing was an Abyssinian king who was known to regularly cross-dress and walk about his palace in female clothes. And in fact, that was his downfall, because the story about him cross-dressing got out. His enemies found out about it, saw that as a weakness, and decided that it was time to attack him, and he lost the battle. But we have had a long history of that. I'm not going to go through all of that today because I just want to be a fairly short show, but I want to look at how it became so much a part of our culture. So we're going to, I'm going to share one on my screen and have a little look at a quick PowerPoint presentation here, and just to see how this all goes. I think we'll leave it at that with a fairly big screen. Where did it all start? Well, let me track back, because if you remember the last couple of Sundays, I've been talking about some of the other aspects of the whole area of trans and gender nonconformity. I'm going to go back to 1400s, Joan of Arc. And I'm sure you've heard of Joan of Arc, young woman who in France. France was having a battle with Britain. I think Britain at that stage owned or had occupied the whole Brittany coastline. Anyway, Burgundy. There was a battle going on, and the French were not doing very well. And Joan had this vision. This apparently, God had spoken to her and told her she had to go and help. So she rushed off to find the Dauphin, the leader, the French aristocrat, a young boy, in fact, very young man. He'd come to the throne at a young age, and she convinced him that she had a message from God to help the French. And with pretty much nothing else that she could do, the French generals were making a complete mess of it. They were really on the point of completely losing. And so in she went to help lead them. She wasn't fighting so much as bringing strategy and such like. And the French took advantage of it. And all of a sudden, the British found themselves on the losing end of it. A peace deal was struck. And part of that deal was that they said they wanted Joan to be taken prisoner. Now, why do you think? We all know the story about Joan of Arc. She died burnt at the stake. But most people, when I ask them this, and I've regularly asked this at workshops, why do we think Joan of Arc was burned at the stake? And nearly everybody says it was heresy, or it was because she was a witch, because that's what most people think of, women burned at the stake for being witches. But actually, the truth is way more bizarre than that. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake and put to death for dressing as a man, for cross-dressing. It was illegal for women to pass off as a man, because men were their betters and they were not allowed to pass off as their betters. After her death, the Catholic Church decided that they didn't agree with this, and they were basically going to canonize her, make her a saint. And so they reinvestigated the crime, and they found that, yes, she had worn a man's suit of armor in battle. Had she not done so, she would have been killed. But the point was, there were no suits of armor for women. They were barely able to find a suit of armor small enough to fit her anyway, but they did find one. And that was why she wore a suit of armor that had been made for a very young man. And the second thing was, when she was then put in prison, when she'd been handed over to the British, she wore trousers. And the reason she wore trousers is because if she didn't, the guards in the prison would try to rape her. And so they basically said that she had been it had all been a big mistake. It had all been wrong. She wasn't passing herself off as a man at all. And she was found innocent bit late, but at least she could become a saint, Saint Joan of Arc. So that's the thing, that there was this real pressure against it, and right the way through Elizabethan times, it was pretty much illegal for women to dress in male clothes. Any woman who was caught in male clothes was very likely to be set outside the prison and be in a pillory and have rotten fruit and various other things thrown at them for a while, and then put in prison to ruminate on their heinous crime. Moll Cutpurse was probably one of the very first women that was really talked about. A play was written by Middleton and Decker, and this was the end of the Elizabethan reign, the beginning of James' reign. But it was based on a real life person, Mary Frith. And Mary Frith was actually Britain's first highwayman. A bit of a rogue. Moll Cutpurse. Now, let's just be clear. Moll gives us clear. Moll is actually generally a term for a prostitute, and not a very high class one. And Cutpurse is the term for a pickpocket, a thief. So there was no question about it. Mary Frith was a bit of a rogue. Would be down in the pub with the lads. She carried a sword. She smoked a pipe, and constantly defied the rules on what she was allowed to wear. And hence the play, The Roaring Girl, made about her. So all the way through, we've got this sense that women are in a difficult place and they're not allowed to dress as men. And of course, all the way through this time in Elizabethan theatre, women were not allowed to act. All the female roles were played by men. And very often you'd have a boy playing a girl, pretending to be a boy. Because if you think about Twelfth Night, for example, Viola plays. Viola is a twin who has been almost died in a shipwreck. When she lands, she's a woman alone, and this is really important. It was not safe for women to walk around on their own. Not safe at all. Some parts of the world now, it's still not safe for women to do that. So in order to be able to move around and not bring bad attention to themselves, women frequently dressed as men in order to simply disappear, not be noticed. And so this is what happened with so many. So there's the whole, so much, and you see this happening so often in Shakespeare plays. That's exactly what happened to Viola, except she then fell in love with somebody. And the whole idea is that it's actually quite a humorous area. But you'll find if you look at Shakespeare's plays, I think there's about 6 plays where we've got boys playing girls or boys playing girls playing boys, mucking around and playing with gender, but all the time. We've got young boys into the theatre playing girl roles all the time. So Shakespeare was familiar with this whole area of cross-dressing. And I suspect that quite often these young boys who were actors actually almost lived as women. And we'll see how that happens again. Now, 1533, the Buggery Act brought in by Henry VIII, reenacted by Elizabeth in 1553. So now we're living in a world where, quite literally, it's illegal, and it's a death penalty if you're caught. Now, for most of the 16th century, there was nothing. Into the 17th century, things started to change. No question about that. And we're going to look at just exactly by the 18th century, there was quite a campaign, ruthless campaign by religious organizations, not like the church. These were people who were overzealous Christians who were hell-bent on making sure that we eradicated homosexuality. There's all sorts of problems that happened. The laws were changed. We had basically the Offences Against the Person Act, which replaced the Buggery Act, and that was then replaced again in 1861. And whilst the death penalty still existed, they'd taken away now the ability of the state to confiscate an entire, the guilty person's entire estate. So it wasn't quite such a horrible penalty. Now, when James I came to the throne, it's very odd. We know that James I was bisexual. We know he had a string of male lovers. and we've got details of all of that. But James didn't do anything to repeal the Buggery Act, which is quite interesting. At the same time, James did obviously authorize the Bible as we know it, the King James I. Bible is that very Bible. It was written up obviously by scholars and theologians. James had a few minor changes in it. There actually isn't very much in the Bible against homosexuality. What there is really a bit subtle. It can be interpreted in a number of ways, just as why there's so much argument about it. When it comes to cross-dressing, the only reference in the Bible to cross-dressing is a reference in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 5. Oh, I know this one. A man shall not wear that which pertains to woman, nor women that which pertaineth to man, for it is an abomination to the Lord. So men shall not wear women's clothes, and women shall not wear men's clothes, for basically God doesn't like it. Now, here's the big problem with the Bible. A lot of it was not written down to start with. It was transmitted verbally. So much history was turned into poems, and it was performed by minstrels and actors traveling around and telling stories. And they told those in forms of rhyme so that it was actually more memorable. It was in Aramaic in the New Testament. The Old Testament would have all been in Greek or Hebrew. Then it all got transcribed into Latin during the sort of the first 1,000 years, from 325 when Constantine set up the Roman Catholic Church. Everything was being in Latin. That was transcribed from it, and then it was translated into English. Now, I'm learning French at the moment, and to be honest, sometimes I think, how on earth do I translate that? Because there are things which just don't translate. Most languages say things and are based upon culture, which is very hard to translate from one to the other. So a trans Hebrew scholar has looked at this piece in the Bible and said, no, it's actually been mistranslated. It's actually about not allowing a woman to wear the armor of a man, which actually makes sense, because this was written, Deuteronomy was written while the Israelites were traveling in the wilderness or in the Sinai desert, and they were constantly being attacked, and their young men were being killed off, and they were left with few people to fight. And think about it now. Even today, the Israelis' women's army is one of the most feared in the world. So it's quite likely that that's just simply a misunderstanding. Because at the time, when this was written, what did men wear? Well, sort of like a smock, and women wore what? Sort of like a smock. So when men and women are actually wearing the same clothes, why on earth would you have a rule that said you can't cross-dress? Well, actually, there was no obvious sense of anybody cross-dressing anyway. Everybody was in the desert wearing basically very simple robes. Nothing of it made sense. And in the context of everything else in Deuteronomy, it didn't make sense. So we've got to be very careful. An awful lot of what's in the Bible may have been misinterpreted, may have been mistranslated, and that's certainly the case for that. Now, 17th century cross-dressing, what happened is, and I think this is probably because we had a long period of time of women, first Mary, then Elizabeth, and there seems to be this sense of re-establishing male authority. Difficult with James I, because he wasn't the most masculine of men. But what we get is a little book, The Man Woman. It's a story about how awful it is, women increasingly wearing male clothes. And then out comes a second book. Now, it's probably, due to the style, probably written by the same person. It's a little bit of irony. It's a little bit of humor in it. It's women saying, hey, guys, don't you start having to go at us about wearing men's clothes. Look at what you're wearing. You guys have taken all ours, and we're just being picking up with what's left. And if you think about that time, Elizabethan, Jacobean time, clothing that was worn by men and women was quite flamboyant, quite feminine, to be honest. High-heeled shoes for men and tight, stockings, makeup, wigs, all of that was very much the male, attire, stuff which today we associate with women. But it was a time when there was a lot of pressure put on women. Women were regularly arrested, regularly put in prison for passing off as men. And as I said, often women had to do this in order to travel unchaperoned because it wasn't a safe place for people to travel around. Once we got into the 18th century, things changed a lot. We've not seen much use of the Buggery Act in terms of and the Offence Against the Person Act. Very few men had actually been arrested. Very few had been put to death. But in the 18th century, the 1700s, that changed dramatically. And what happened here was that in order to disguise the fact that they were with a woman, or that they were with a man, the men would encourage the younger rent boys, the younger gay prostitutes, to dress as women. And in fact, there were houses set up all over the place, and the numbers of houses was quite considerable, considering the small populations of places like Manchester and London, Liverpool. The Molly houses were quite prolific. There were a lot of them, and this was a place where men could go and they could find young men to have sex with. And they were generally dressed in a very flamboyant way. And the well-known one is a play being produced about Mother Clapp's Molly House in 1726 was arrested. And the Pilgrim group had basically sent people in to try and infiltrate these organizations, find out what was going on, get evidence and information, and then come in and bust them. And they a lot of men were arrested. I believe the number was 5 were put to death. 8 or 9 were actually arrested on this night that it was that they were busted by the police. And there were all sorts of things going on then to try to arrest men. If you look at the case history during the 1700s, week after week, there are more men being put to death because they were being found. And it was even writing a letter was enough to cause it. But you can see what's happening. In order to disguise the fact that somebody's with a man, one of the men dresses women. And this is where we start to see this regular culture of men dressing as women in order to disguise the fact that they were men. And it made a lot of sense, particularly when so many people were being put to death. It's much more difficult to catch you out if you seem to be with a woman. And 18th century was also a time we started to see the rise of the vaudeville theatre. And a lot of the men, because of the way the Molly houses work, entertainment started to occur. Men would get up and dance and play act as women and play these games. Bert Savoy, very famous 18th century drag queen. As we move towards the 19th century, start to see even more of the female impersonators. Now, there's a difference between female impersonators and drag queens. Drag queens tend to be very cutting, very catty humor. It's very, very provocative humor, quite lewd, quite loud. Female impersonators, on the other hand, it was all about how well that they could pass off, how well they looked as women. It wasn't so in your face. Now, I know a lot of trans people who've done drag, and they tend to be female impersonators because it's not about poking fun at women. It's actually about emulating women in the best that they possibly can. Julian Eltinge, one of the most famous, performed at the London Palladium, even performed especially for the King, toured Europe and USA. And all of this was the vaudeville and music hall theatres. Now, this was family entertainment. If you were going to take your children to an entertainment, you would take them to a vaudeville theatre, a music hall theatre. Music hall probably more later, but there were matinee performances. And this was be magicians, Houdini, there would be singers, and there would be female impersonators, drag queens performing, and that was family entertainment. And it became very much a big part of family entertainment. What wasn't being understood was that very many of these men who were impersonating women were actually gay men. And the theatre has always had a strong attraction for gay men. Partly, if you think of the Shakespearean theatre, it's, again, men playing women. Very often are gay men or trans people attracted to men at a time when there wasn't anything you could physically do about it. All you could do was change your appearance. So everybody, trans or gay, they were treated as gay. So let me have a look at Mae West. because I was quite surprised when I found out about this. Mae West was a great vaudeville performer. She had actually performed from the age of 5. So we're talking about late 18th century. Mae West was on the stage. Her parents were both performers. And she also wrote plays. Very, very strong gay rights activist. Became a hugely successful Hollywood star, the most successful at one point, estimated to have been the wealthiest woman in America. She was so successful. And this is some of the, gives you an idea of some of the sorts of plays. If you cannot stand excitement, see your doctor before visiting Mae West in Sex. So she really did push the boundaries of what was considered, decency. She wrote these plays, Sex. She produced a play called Drag, which was basically closed down by the police. They went in and they found that it was actually not an appropriate play. It was talking about homosexuality. She actually covered all of the costs, the legal fees for every single member of the cast, looked after all the cast extremely well, fought some battle. She then produced another one called Pleasure Man. Pleasure Man was very much about life backstage in the vaudeville theatre, where we start to see the female impersonators and the drag queens actually in open relationships backstage with other men. It lasted about 15 minutes before it was closed down. But that was when we were starting to get this real pressure in America, this, anti-gay attitude, which lasted right the way through until the 1970s. In fact, it's still there now to some extent. But we've never lost it, have we? Right the way through the 18th, 19th century, we've had women playing principal boys in pantomime. We've had men playing the pantomime dames, and Christopher Biggins. I lost count of how many. He's been doing pantomime dames all his career, and it's a really huge, big thing. We still take our kids to see the pantomime every year at Christmas. It's the main kids' entertainment, and it's all about cross-dressing on stage and it being an acceptable, fun part of life. And of course, when we look at what's happened through the 20th century with glam rock and more performers coming out and breaking those gender rules on stage and in performance, cross-dressing has become an integral part of it. What we don't see so much of, which I found quite interesting, is drag kings, but that's now getting bigger and bigger. So where we tend to think of RuPaul's Drag Race and that sort of sense, I mean, I go to Pride events, and what would a Pride event be like without drag queens? Now, take back now to 1972, 73. At that time, Montreal was doing its first Pride event. They banned drag queens and transvestites and transsexuals from attending the Pride because they felt that all of these men dressed as women, or even women dressed as men, women going outrageous costume, because women do drag as well as drab, they felt that was taking away from them. The campaign was trying to present gay men and lesbian women as just normal people like any other cisgender person, except that we just happen to be in relationships with same-sex persons, but just normal people. And of course, along comes the drag queens, along come the transvestites and the transsexuals, all this color and cross-dressing and all weird, and that was really messing up the campaign. So they tried to actually exclude trans people, and there's lots and lots of evidence of the way in which trans people were excluded by the LGBT community, quite a lot. Similar to the kind of campaign that's going on at the moment. We've always been this sort of tension between the flamboyant the flamboyant side of the LGBT community and the more straight side of it. But these are the drag queens, and some of you will remember Conchita Wurst, who won the Eurovision Song Contest. Stunning, a beautiful woman with a beard, actually, somebody who's really non-binary, somewhere in the middle. And that's what we're now seeing more and more. These are, women, men, trans men, non-binary, women doing drag. So everybody's now beginning to play this, and we've turned it into an art form, which I think is quite good. And the more we do this, the more we just play and are playful with the whole area of drag, the whole area of non-conforming performance, the better I think it is for everybody. Because once we're free to express ourselves in any way we want, I think we'll start to get freer to get on with our own lives and stop worrying about what people are wearing and how they're presenting themselves. So there we go. That's the whole way. I should take it off before we started. Don't forget, Trans and Non-Binary Inclusion Workshop, 20th of October. Find the details down below in the notes below this video, or in Facebook. It'll be there as well. Go along to Eventbrite. Just book yourself on. There's no fixed fee. I'm just suggesting pay what you can afford. I want to make this open so people can come, and it's all about trying to understand much more about gender nonconformity within the workplace. How do we make gender nonconformity more inclusive? How do we make sure that people who don't fit into the binary of male or female feel welcome, feel belonging, feel as if they're part of the team? What do we do? What do we need to do to make sure that that works? Now, tomorrow I have another guest, Pam Burrows, who is she's part of a small group of LGBT speakers in the Professional Speaking Association. She focuses on wellness. I'm going to be talking to her a little bit about wellness and stress and how that's affecting people within the LGBT community at the moment. But that's tomorrow. So join me there for another chat with a guest. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And I will let you get back now to your Sunday night and enjoy.